do that, and then I'm gonna do that, that. Okay, here we go. Okay, so can you see the watercolor paper there?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm working on a full sheet. It's 22 by 30, and I'm working on the back side because the back side of watercolor paper has more tooth and more texture, and it lends itself much more readily to doing a layered painting in this style. And I want a lot of texture. So I have my very largest watercolor brush. I actually want to get a bigger one. They have really wide, flat ones, but this is my jumbo round, and I'm going to wet the whole back side of the paper, making sure that I don't leave any dry paper at all. You really want to coat the whole surface, and the water is going to soak into the paper and be absorbed by the fibers.
And is it better to use a brush? Can you use a spray bottle to wet it, or is a brush better?
A spray bottle is trickier because it doesn't really coat the whole thing, you know. But what you could do, what I'm going to do next now is I'm going to wipe off the excess water on the surface because I don't want any puddles of water sitting on the surface. I want it to be evenly kind of soaked and damp, but not like puddles of water. So I suppose what you could do is you could spray a generous amount of water on the paper and then spread it around with a sponge, because the main thing is you want to get the whole thing coated. And this way the water is in the fibers of the paper. So I'm going to do a complementary colors, and my two colors are going to be basically violet and gold. So I'm going to mix up a couple of violets, and these are my watercolors. I've got a blue and I've got an opera rose that I'm adding to it to mix up my violet. And I'm just going to lay out a swath of color in a very broad shape with very broad strokes on that side, and then another one over here. You want to keep your, don't get too fussy yet. You want to start off with just really broad general shapes. But within those, you can see I've got a little bit of darker blue violet kind of I'm laying it out on the edge there. And you can see how it's spreading out, it's spreading out a little bit on the edges. The edges are pretty soft. That's because the paper's wet. If you painted on dry paper, you'd have a sharp, hard edge. But this is going to be a soft edge painting. And since I'm working with complementary colors, I need to keep my shapes separate. So now I'm mixing up more of a pinky kind of a purple using, I think that's cobalt violet mostly, and connecting those two shapes along the bottom here. My concept for this painting is spiritual light coming down into my body. So that was kind of the idea. And I'm putting some more of that cobalt violet-y color along the top of that shape. So when I first started, all I had in mind was that shape on the right and then the shape on the lower left. I didn't have any other preconceived ideas of where I was going to go. I just knew I wanted to start with those shapes. So now I'm just following my intuition, and I'm establishing a little bit of a diagonal movement coming down, and that will, you know, and I'm leaving some whites, and that will give some space for the light, the golden light, to kind of come in. So I brought some purple up into that upper left-hand corner. So now there's that little bit of tension between the diagonal of the upper left and the lower right. I decided, I have some yellow, but I decided I wanted some iridescent gold. And I'm digging around looking for my acrylic ink, but I didn't have any. So I went over to my acrylic container, and I do have a golden liquid acrylic. And so I used that. It's an iridescent gold. So you can use your liquid, you can use your acrylics, you can actually use any acrylic. You just want to, you know, water it down a little bit to get some flow happening. So I'm squeezing some of that out into my palette. And now I'm using a flat brush, and I'm going to start laying in some gold, and I'm going right up to the edge of the purple with the directly with the gold. I'm going to add some yellow watercolor to this later, but I'm just starting with the gold. Again, even though I'm only using 2 basic colors, within those 2 basic colors, I'm mixing a variety of colors. So you have a range of color. And this is just kind of the base layer. I'm getting my shapes established. Kind of feeling my way here. I'm just putting those in, and this, and I do this standing up. It keeps me a little more in my body and more loose. And it's just better when you're painting in this kind of general, kind of freed up way to be standing.
Are you listening to music?
Yeah, I have my music on. Music is crucial. Yeah, I feel like music is crucial. I'm listening to music. And I've got my headphones on. It's funny, when I play these videos back, sometimes they're silent, and sometimes you can hear the noise in the background. And I haven't figured out what that's about, but just to be on the safe side, I'm wearing my headphones. So now I'm mixing in, this is just like a lemon yellow, cadmium yellow watercolor that I'm mixing in because I'm wanting some brightness to it. And you know, the paper's still damp enough. You can see how easily the colors are mixing because they're still damp. Even though I sponged off that excess water, enough soaked into the paper. And if you add water to your watercolors, that's how you get a lighter tone. So the less water you add, the more saturated your color is going to be. The more water you add, the more transparent and lighter it's going to be. Because in watercolor, we use the white of the paper. Since it's a transparent medium, we use the white of the paper to determine our value changes. So like I wanted it to get lighter up at the top, so I added more water. You have to be a bit careful when you're working with complementary colors, because if you mix them, you'll get a brown or a neutral. And sometimes that's a really beautiful thing, but a lot of times that's not what you want. So now I'm going to go in, even though it's still damp, I'm going to start building up my layers. So I'm going down here with my, I still have my flat brush, and you can really see the brush strokes here. So it's creating some texture. And you can see I accidentally dropped some gold paint in the very lower right. So I'm using that as a guiding point to drop in some more gold over here. So sometimes our accidents can kind of guide us to incorporate things that we wouldn't normally do. Doing a little brushwork there between the two colors meeting. And I'm getting some darker blue. And I'm going to build up. I want to start now creating more contrast. Like I have the general swaths of color. So now it's about deepening my darks, getting some texture, getting some different mark makings and some interesting visual passages. So
Carissa, is everything still wet?
it's damp. It's still damp. Yep. So the colors are still kind of flowing and blending right on the paper. You can see here how I'm laying down this pinky violet, and it's pretty much merging with that darker color. And also, when you work, I'm bouncing around all over the place on this paper. I'm not getting stuck on one area. And so consequently, since I'm simultaneously working the whole sheet, you know, every time I put some more wet paint down, it's going to keep the paper wet. So nothing really has a chance to dry. I also want to point out, I did leave a little bit of the white of the paper. You can see in the center area of the yellow. I wanted a little bit of the white to show through. And that's, you know, one of the big choices that you have to make when you're doing watercolor is whether, because unlike painting on a canvas with acrylic where you pretty much, I mean, not always, but more often than not, you're going to be painting over the entire surface. But with watercolor paper, you know, you can use the white of the paper. So that's one of the biggest decisions that you have to make. And I think it's a good idea to make that decision before you begin, so you know, because you have to leave it. That area got a little too heavy up there, so I blotted it with a paper towel. Here I'm just adding some water to try to kind of smooth it out. And then bringing some of that purple down. You can see I'm kind of getting some textural brush strokes in there. Now I'm going to add some salt to get some texture, and this is a really fun thing to do. And you know, it's absolutely crucial to do this while the paint is still wet. It won't do anything if the paint is dry. And you get a different effect depending on how wet and how much pigment there is. And it's kind of a hard thing to control. So it's just, you know, it's one of those process things where you just have to surrender and go for it. You can use any kind of salt. I'm using kosher salt here because it's a little more coarse. And I like to kind of, you know, really get a nice texture. But you can also use table salt. It will just be a little more fine. Here I have more dense gold, and I'm just kind of bringing that up. I'm putting it on top of my gold, but I'm also bringing it into the purple a little bit. The more dry your paint is, the less it will merge into mud when you add it to its opposite. And now I've got a round, this is a round, I think I'm using my mop brush, which holds a lot of water, but it's rounded.
Can you say a word about the mop brush? Is that when would you use it? Or, I mean, they're sort of fuzzy, furry things, aren't they?
Yeah, you use it when it really holds a lot of water. You use it when you want a really soft kind of, you don't want like um, you don't want like a defined kind of shape. And also it holds a lot of water. So
Carissa,
now,
can you use those same kinds of brushes with watered down acrylic, or is it just for
yeah,
watercolor paint?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You just have to make sure you clean them really well when you're done and don't let the acrylic paint dry on them.
Okay.
So now this area is a little more dry, but it's still wet enough that when I lay those strokes of the opera rose down, um, they're kind of a little more defined. And I'm using pretty heavy dark pigment on these. So now I'm kind of going into my detail, putting in some patterns, and this is using the back end of the brush to scrape in to get a little texture that way. And I'm just kind of randomly scraping around. Yeah, I put the opera rose into those little crevices where the purple and the gold were meeting because I want to kind of bring some focal points in. That becomes a little more area of tension there with the contrast. And so it's going to bring your eye in. I'm going to splatter some paint down here. I'm going to sprinkle some gold up there. And that's a nice way if you want to do an opposite color on top of another one without it being muddy. If you do this splatter technique, it tends to, stand out. And now I'm sprinkling this product called Brusho, which is really fun. I'm using brown. I wanted to get some darks. I wanted to get more contrast and more texture into my darks. And Brusho is just dry powdered water soluble pigment. And the fun thing is that even though this color is, actually this is black, and I had never used the black before, but the black, all the Brusho pigments, even though they have, they're named by one color, they actually have several different colored pigments in them, and they show through once it dissolves. So this dissolves at different rates and spreads at different rates depending on how wet the paper is. And you can sprinkle it into just a watered down area or to an area that's wet paint. But again, it has to be wet in order for it to work. And now I have just my blue. I didn't put any water on my brush. It's just pure pigment. And I'm wanting to kind of bring out the pattern of the scratch marks. So I'm kind of painting in between those to exaggerate it. Again, just to create a little visual interest and variety. So you can see the range of purples I have. It shows all the colors that I've used for mixing up my purples. It's got the opera rose and the blue and then everything in between. So the more variety of color you can get within your color family, the better. And now the paper is starting to dry a little more. So the brush strokes are have more definition. They're not so blended. So what you can see happening is the Brusho, and you'll see more in the final painting that I show, but the Brusho on the left had more red in it, and the Brusho at the top, it's starting to emerge now. There was actually a little bit of turquoise in that. And I don't have any turquoise in my painting. And I just so happen to have, you can see it in the lower right corner of the video there, I actually happen to have a little turquoise in my palette. So I'm going to bring some of that turquoise into the painting. So, you know, if it's just in one spot, it's really going to draw your eye to it. And I didn't want that area to be so standing out on its own. But I also want to just point out how I repeated those upper rose brush strokes from the lower right, a couple in the center, and then going up to the left. Again, kind of accentuating that tension between the two corners. I'm going to add more salt. Come on, Georgie. Come on in.
Carissa, do you think the salt would work on acrylic paint?
Not as much. If it's super watered down and you do it right away, it might. I've used it on my acrylic inks, but it definitely works better with the watercolor. What it does is it kind of repels the paint out. But, you know, give it a try. I mean, it's worth trying. So here I am, I'm putting some turquoise in. I'm using a little flat brush. And since that's at the top, I'm going to bring some of that color down to the bottom and then also over to the right. So there's the triangle, right? You know? And a little bit up there too, near the explosion of the brush show. Okay, am I done yet? I guess I'm gonna drop in a little more gold over here. It's kind of like weaving, you know, I feel like it's like this weaving process of weaving the colors and weaving the textures together. And as I keep emphasizing, you know, you just want to know, like, what's the one next step? What's the one next move to make here? This is not planned out. You just do one step at a time and you just take it as it comes.
Carissa, do you think it will dry close to the color that it is right now?
Yep. I'll show you the finished one at the end.
Okay. Because with the fluid acrylics that we use, sometimes they do dry differently.
Okay, yeah, I have one on my table that I started this morning and I'm looking at it. It's not entirely dry yet, but yeah, I could see, well, I don't know, it looks pretty good. But I understand, sometimes it dries lighter.
Yeah.
I tend to work, you know, you can see I tend to work pretty saturated. And also with all this layering, you're layering color on top of color and it's really soaking into the paper. It gets a nice rich surface. So I'm just doing a final little bit of sprinkling of salt and I think I'm done. So let me see if I can get the finished painting up here. Where did it go?
I'd be interested to see that in different directions too.
Ooh.
Let me try to, here, you guys, I moved you. This is so funny. Okay, so can you see that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you can see, now here you can really see the iridescent gold.
Yeah, you couldn't see that before.
Yeah, you couldn't see it in the light. I brought this out on the deck to photograph and it really shows up nicely. So here's the salt effect. There's some over here, there's a little bit going on over here, and there's some right down here.
Carissa, do the salt crystals just stay on the paper then?
So what you do is you totally want to allow them to dry, and then you just brush off the crystals.
Okay.
And then it leaves that texture. What it does is it absorbs the pigment, I think. It kind of repels it out and it absorbs it. And then you just brush them off.
Thank you.
You can see, like, this is where the wet paint met more of a dry area. These are little mini blooms happening over here, but they're kind of nice. You know, the wonderful thing about painting in a layered, wet, really, well, wet on damp technique is all these subtleties that you get. You don't get these when you just do one layer on the painting in one shot. You only get this by building it up and building it up. You know, this lovely pattern that happened because of this mistake here. But you can see how I repeat a little gold. So there's a little bit of gold kind of sprinkled everywhere. So here's the brush show. This one you can see has more of like a burnt sienna color in it. And then this one had some of the turquoise. And here's the little bit of the white paper here. And I think there's a little bit here, not much, but a little bit of white paper there. And then here's the texture of the paintbrush, and then here's the texture of the mark making with the end of the brush. You can also use a stick or a twig, and it works even better. The brush is still kind of rounded, but like I used a twig in, I'll show it to you. Let me see here.
Are you able to turn it in different directions?
Sure. Here, do you see the scratch marks in this? This one was done with a twig.
Wow.
That's an abstract landscape I did.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. So let's see here. How can I
Get it.
Over
Rotate.
on the right.
Oh, there you go. Hmm.
Yeah. There. Oh, interesting.
there it is upside down.
There's a button on the right top that you can just do it instead of going to the menu.
The right top, under more. Oh, this
Just-
one?
Yeah.
Oh,
Mm,
um,
I don't know about that.
yeah, I'm not gonna mess with that because I'm gonna go with where actually it went away. Oh, there we go. We'll look at it one more time.
Mm.
I don't know, do you have a preference for a better? There's the original.
Yeah.
I like the original.
I guess I like the original too.
Yeah, I think I do too. Okay, so
I have two questions.
Okay.
Well, it's interesting because some of this layering kind of results in a little bit of the pouring concept in terms of blending and things just kind of going together. So that was sort of interesting. You mentioned the triangle. I don't know if I missed that earlier. Was that in reference to the?
That's just in reference to composition. It's just nice. It's just a really good tool to have when you're creating a composition, is to create a triangle. So it's very subtle, but I've got this turquoise at the bottom edge over here and up here, and it creates a triangle.
Okay, thank
it's
you.
really subtle, but it's just one of those things.
Yeah.
There's kind of a triangle up here with these brusho explosions.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So is there no such thing as white watercolor?
There's white gouache.
Gouache.
Yeah, and there might even be white watercolor. I don't tend to use it. I tend to use the white of my paper.
The paper.
The other thing you can use, there's a product called Frisket, and it's a masking fluid, and you can go and paint in any areas that you want to keep white, and then you can just paint over the whole thing. And when it's totally dry, you just rub off the masking fluid, and then you have the white of the paper.
What is it called again?
Frisket.
FR?
Frisk.
Thank you.
IT or ET.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop that,
Cool.
and I'm